Well, I stopped counting when I hit about 50, and that was when I was in D.C., which was in 1993.
Have you been consistently employed as a toxicologist since 1993?
I have been a toxicologist with the medical examiner's office since I finished my doctorate in 91.
Have you been testifying for all of those years as well?
Yes.
At this time, the state would tender the witness to counsel for voir dire.
No questions.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Thank you. Okay. Dr. Kunsman, did you have an occasion to become involved in the Broward Medical Examiner case 2014-1118 regarding an individual, Fakhruddin Knight?
Yes, I have.
And did you prepare a report on that?
I did.
So I'm going to use your report up here for demonstrative purposes because some of these things are a little bit difficult to say, much less spell. So I'm going to start in this case. What specimen?
If it's all right, since I can't see that, is it all right if I look at my copy of the report?
I want to start in this case. You received what specimens to test?
We received the autopsy specimens, bile, cavity blood, brain, gastric contents, liver, ocular fluid, which is vitreous fluid, the fluid in the eye, and a blood specimen that did not have any preservative in it or anticoagulant, and so we list those as serum.
And so could you please define for the jury what is cavity blood?
Cavity blood is the term given to the fluid that is withdrawn from the chest cavity when at autopsy. Typically, cavity fluid is collected in cases in which there's been significant trauma to the chest or the abdominal, essentially the main core of the body. And when that blood accumulates in the chest cavity, the medical examiner will simply collect that because the normal specimens that we prefer to be collected or are typically collected, which are called peripheral blood, and in our office that's typically blood collected from the subclavian artery, so that's up in the around the shoulder and neck area, and it's called peripheral because it isn't central blood, which is heart blood. When those can't be obtained and there's a pooled specimen in the chest cavity, that's what we call that.
Does cavity blood also include interstitial fluid?
Well, when the blood is pools in the chest cavity, it bathes the other organs or the other tissues that are present, and that would involve, in the event that there's any gastric or stomach damage, it might contain stomach contents. Interstitial fluid is just that, essentially it's that stuff that's in between all of the cells. And so in your body, cells contain a fluid so things can move around. And there's also a fluid between cells so stuff can move between cells. That's the technical term, stuff, for things like hormones, and drugs do that, and other blood components. So pooled blood or cavity blood being bathing the organs then essentially just picks up all of that fluid, and so it's partly blood, it's partly other things.
So when you receive a post-mortem case, what's the first thing you do?
When The autopsy is completed. Someone on my staff goes to an area in the morgue where the specimens have been, after they've been logged in by the medical examiner, they're stored, and we pick them up, bring them into the toxicology laboratory, and go through a process we call accessioning. That is, we verify the information on the label, make sure that the name is correct, that we have specimens that we're expecting to get based on what's in our laboratory information management system, or just the computer system. And then we record what we've received, transfer that to a secured walk-in cooler that has limited access by a magnetic card, so that only toxicology staff have access to the specimens. And then the routine panel of tests that we perform are assigned in the computer system.
So let's start where you said the routine panel. What is the first test that you do?
Tests are not necessarily always performed in a certain order, but the most common, the way that we think about the testing is that the first test is the volatiles analysis. That's the test for ethyl alcohol, and in that procedure we're also able to identify isopropanol, otherwise known as rubbing alcohol, and other volatile compounds, just low molecular weight compounds that evaporate easily.
Let me interrupt you for just a moment. You said ethanol. Can you please define for the jury what ethanol is?
Yes, ethyl alcohol is the byproduct or the waste product of yeast when you give them sugar to eat, and it is commonly referred to as drinking alcohol. It's the stuff that's in beer, liquor, and wine, and the reason that people drink it.
And you also look for acetone.
Yes, acetone is, although not an alcohol, we do test. What acetone does is it's an alternate fuel source for all of the cells in the body. If you can't get glucose, then and this is especially true in diabetics, they can't produce or release glucose, and so they break down fat, produce acetone. Although, of course, you can, and some people have consumed alcohol as a beverage.
Did you do a volatile screen in this case?
Yes, we did.
And what were your findings from that?
We detected a 0.08 gram per deciliter of alcohol in the cavity blood, and also a 0.08 in the ocular fluid or the vitreous fluid.
And I'll come back to that in just a moment. I want to go at timing of testing. What time was this testing done versus what your understanding of the date of the death was?
If I can just look through my file, then the volatile analysis was performed on May 1st of 2014. And we received the specimens on the 28th of March of 2014.
I'm sorry, what did you...
I'm sorry, the 28th of April of 2014.
Would the span of time between April 28th and May 1st change anything in the amount of ethanol that was in the blood or ocular fluid?
No. When the specimens are collected in the morgue, within a matter of 30, 40 minutes and probably an hour at the outside, they're moved into the refrigerated body cooler in the autopsy suite. Then when they're transferred from that cooler into the laboratory, they're very quickly transferred into a 3 degrees C, which is refrigerator temperature, just like you have at the temperature is the same as what your refrigerator is at home. Ours is just bigger.
So,
And
if I may interrupt, so this 0.08 grams per deciliter, is that similar to what you know of as the blood alcohol limit for driving?
yes, the legal limit for driving while impaired is a 0.08.
Okay. Does the body continue to process alcohol after death?
No, once death occurs, the enzymes that metabolize alcohol no longer perform that function because there's no energy source to enable them to metabolize. And so in a post-mortem specimen, the alcohol is a reasonable reflection of the alcohol concentration at the time of death.
Can you describe for the jury the relationship between the ethanol level in the blood versus the ethanol level in the ocular fluid?
Yes, when alcohol is absorbed from some from the stomach, most from the small intestine, that passes into the bloodstream. The blood, of course, circulates rapidly throughout the entire body, and alcohol being a very small molecule that is essentially infinitely soluble in water. And so any place in the body that there is water or liquid, alcohol will distribute into that part of the body. And so alcohol, the way we describe it is that's called total body water, and alcohol distributes equally throughout total body water. The vitreous fluid, or as the ocular fluid, is something called an ultrafiltrative plasma. And so what happens is, as the blood circulates, some of that blood, of course, bathes the exterior of the eye, and through a bunch of filters, that blood is transformed into vitreous fluid. Vitreous fluid contains a lot of water. It's very similar in water content to blood. And so as alcohol is absorbed, the alcohol concentration in the body begins to rise. It takes about 30 to 90 minutes for all of the alcohol that a person has consumed once drinking stops, for that alcohol to reach what's called its peak concentration. So all of it's absorbed. Then the alcohol that's in the blood will then, of course, be transferred into the vitreous fluid. But that process takes time, and so the way we describe it is that the vitreous alcohol always trails the blood alcohol. So as blood alcohol is rising, vitreous alcohol rises, but is about 30 minutes behind it. And so blood alcohol concentration in blood is always higher on the absorption part of alcohol distribution than the vitreous. Then a time arises 60 to 90 minutes after the last drink is consumed, and then there's a peak concentration. That's a time during which all of the alcohol is absorbed. The person has reached the highest blood alcohol concentration they will reach. It's in equilibrium, or at the same level as in the vitreous fluid. Then metabolism occurs. Well, actually metabolism occurs as soon as absorption occurs. But once the peak is hit, then only metabolism occurs, so the blood alcohol concentration only decreases. The vitreous will also decrease, but again will trail behind the blood. So in the post-absorptive phase, when only metabolism occurs, the vitreous alcohol is always higher than the blood alcohol.
So Dr. Kunsman, what conclusions can you draw from the two levels being the same on the ocular and the blood alcohol levels?
The decedent was at or around their peak blood alcohol concentration at the time of death.
Okay. After you do the volatile screen, what is the next procedure you did in this case?
We perform what's called an immunoassay screen.
What is that?
That looking at the report in the second column entitled procedure, or with the heading procedure, that's the IA listing. An immunoassay is an antibody-antigen reaction. It's exactly what happens in your body when you're exposed to pollen and your body releases histamine. That's an antibody-antigen reaction. What we've done is we've managed to essentially engineer these antibodies so that they bind to particular drugs. So the immunoassay screen is a quick and relatively easy way to identify whether or not members of particular classes of drugs are present in the body.
So in this case in your report, you have a couple things that are indicated as unconfirmed positive. What does that mean?
In 2014, an unconfirmed positive for the immunoassay simply meant that we had performed an immunoassay result, performed an immunoassay test and got a positive result. The immunoassay doesn't tell you exactly what drug is present. It doesn't tell you how much is present. It simply gives you, it's sort of a yay versus nay result. You get a positive or we report as undetected. In 2014, I was reporting unconfirmed positive for anything that was positive when an additional test to identify specifically what drug was present had not yet been performed.
So in this case, when it goes up and under the G, we have things that indicate positive. What does GCMS stand for?
Gas chromatography mass spectrometry.
In a fourth grade level, explain that to me, please.
That's a black box where we take a specimen and inject it into a heated chamber, which is the gas chromatograph. It vaporizes, goes through something called an analytical column, which separates out different drugs. So if we inject, say, a combination of A, B, and C into the injection port of the gas chromatograph, by the time it reaches the end, well, you start out with A, B, and C all mixed together. When it gets to the end, you have a group of A all put together, a group of B all put together, and then a group of C all put together. Then they pass from the gas chromatograph into the detector, which is a mass spectrometer. What a mass spectrometer does is it shoots high energy electrons at the molecules that are there and fragments them. And what that allows us to do is to identify exactly what A, B, and C are in terms of their structure. And essentially the way that works is every time you hit a molecule with the same energy electron, you get the same fragments. So if I have a vase and I drop it on the floor and it fragments into pieces, if every time that I drop that vase I get the same pieces, I can take those pieces and reassemble them, and I will always get the same vase. And presuming that every vase is unique, then I can always reconstruct that particular drug with that particular vase.
So in this case, I want to go through, and when you go to the GCMS, what substances were found in the cavity blood of Dr. Dean Knight?
We identified cocaine, and some of the cocaine metabolites, and a drug called alpha PVP, which in 2014 in this area, or in Broward County, was better known as Flocka. And we identified the primary inactive metabolite of marijuana.
So let's start with the cocaine. On this concentration, it's a 0.06 milligrams per liter.
Correct.
Can you tell us anything about how long blood would still be positive for cocaine after the last time it was used?
Typically, that's about 10 or 12 hours, and that can mean anywhere from moments after the time of last use to a period about 10 or 12 hours after that time.
And is this until the 10 to 12 hours before the time of death, as we're talking about in this case?
Not necessarily. When cocaine is taken, it very, very rapidly metabolizes, and it breaks down. It metabolizes and breaks down in the bloodstream and in the liver. And so, in about 90 minutes, half of the amount of cocaine. Excuse me, that isn't correct. We use a term in pharmacology called half-life to help us understand how the body handles a particular drug. The half-life represents the time frame during which half of the amount of drug present in the blood will be eliminated. The half-life for cocaine is about 90 minutes. And so the problem with interpreting cocaine is that cocaine can continue to break down in the blood even after death. And cocaine can continue to break down into other components while it's being stored, even if stored in a test tube containing an anticoagulant and a preservative and stored refrigerated. Cocaine will still continue to break down.
And so in this case, can you tell if the method or manner of ingestion of cocaine?
No.
Does that make a difference as to how long it would remain in the system?
To some degree, yes, it does. There's not a whole lot of variation in the time that cocaine remains in the body, but there is some difference, and the typical uses of cocaine, of course, are it's taken IV, it's snorted, or it's smoked, and each of those has a slight the same. Of administration is how quickly the drug penetrates into the central nervous system or into the
cannot
brain.
make a determination as to that from your expertise.
Correct. From a blood concentration or just detection in blood, there is no way to determine route of administration.
Let's move on to the alpha PVP. Prior to May of 2014, had the Broward Medical Examiner's Office seen this chemical come across in a toxicology screen that you performed?
No, we have not identified alpha PVP for this case.
So can you tell the jury what alpha PVP is?
Alpha PVP is referred to as a synthetic cathinone. A cathinone is a particular structure that is related to the primary psychoactive component in a plant called the cat plant, K-H-A-T. It's a plant that we first, grows in Somalia and regions of eastern Africa and the Arabian Peninsula. And so the cathinone present in the cat plant has been altered in the form of alpha PVP, such that it's a stimulant like cathinone, but it has a component that is a hallucinogen like ecstasy or MDMA.
Let me interrupt you for just a moment. What is a stimulant?
A stimulant is a drug that its effect on normal physiology is it increases heart rate, it oftentimes increases blood pressure, it causes the release of other neurochemicals like epinephrine, and it essentially puts you into a neurochemical or a biological condition that's very much like flight or fright syndrome.
Is caffeine a stimulant?
Caffeine is a stimulant.
Is cocaine a stimulant?
Yes.
Is that what my morning coffee does to me? Fight and flight? I'll start there. Okay, going on to, you just said it's like a hallucinogen. What type of hallucinogen did you compare it to?
There's a part of the alpha PVP molecule which is related to methamphetamine and to MDMA, which is ecstasy.
And to your knowledge, are there any human studies or trials of alpha PVP?
There are no clinical trials in which alpha PVP has been given to study its pharmacology, how it alters normal physiology. No studies related to what we think of when a pharmaceutical company tries to introduce a new medication. Then they run a number of studies to, measure side effects, evaluate the general effects on normal physiology. But nothing like that on alpha PVP.
Is there any information, research, data regarding interactions between alpha PVP and alcohol?
No.
Alpha PVP and cocaine?
No.
And in terms of the alpha PVP in this individual system, can you give us a time frame as to when it was ingested?
No.
Can you tell me the purity level?
No.
The dosage?
No.
Can you make any opinion as to whether or not the alpha PVP and the cocaine were ingested at the same time?
No.
Can you make any opinion as to whether or not the alpha PVP was cut into cocaine?
No.
Do you know what I mean when I say cut?
Yes. We have seen, occasionally we're required to facilitate understanding what's going on in a particular decedent. We obtain drugs and paraphernalia found at the scene of that person's death. And we test those, and on a few occasions I have identified compounds, powders, tablets, or syringe contents which contain a mixture of cocaine and, if not alpha PVP, some other cathinone.
Okay.
But there's no way to tell whether or not from the postmortem blood or the postmortem cavity blood, whether or not they were taken simultaneously, whether they were taken as a mixture, or one taken and then the other taken almost contemporaneously.
So moving on to the cannabis. On your report you have under the GCMS delta-9 THC, none detected. What conclusions can you draw from that result?
Delta-9 THC is the primary psychoactive component in marijuana. It's the cannabinoid in marijuana that exerts its effects of euphoria, appetite stimulation. It's essentially the reason that people smoke marijuana. The fact that there is no active drug present, but only delta-9-carboxy-THC, which is the metabolite of the active drug, suggests that the time frame of use, and again this depends upon the habit of the person using the drug, what general purity they use marijuana, and I'll talk about smoking marijuana since that's still the most common route of administration. So we don't, I'm sorry, what this tells us is that the time of last smoking of marijuana was probably somewhere within 2 to 3 hours as a conservative estimate, since we found the inactive drug but no active drug.
Finish in 1 moment, Kathleen? Nothing further.
Thanks.
Mr. Kimmel, do you need the...
No. You know, leave it up there. Maybe it will. Thanks. Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon.
Did I hear you right on direct? This was the very first case where you found flocka in somebody's system in Broward County?
Yes, to the best of my recollection.
Okay, and that was in April of 2014, correct?
Yes.
This certain...
Yes, the death occurred on the 26th.
This certainly was not the last flocka case you had in your office, is that correct?
No.
You had almost an explosion of flocka cases going into 2014 and 2015, is that correct?
Correct. We had 62 cases attributed to either alpha PVP intoxication alone or in combination with other drugs. Okay. And we still continue to detect alpha PVP in some of our cases.
I want to make sure I understand the difference between toxicology and pharmacology. Am I correct that toxicology is essentially the study of identifying substances in the body?
Toxicology is a branch of pharmacology in which we're interested in studying the adverse effects of drugs and poisons on organisms. The most interesting organism, of course, being people.
Okay. So I'm glad you corrected me. So toxicology is specifically studying how these substances affect, in your case, people, correct?
Correct, but in pharmacology studies the effects of drugs because we're interested in how they alter normal human physiology, normal responses. Pharmacology being principally interested in beneficial effects. Toxicology being interested in those adverse effects of those drugs.
Okay. Let's talk about alcohol for a second. You test the decedent's, I don't want to misspeak, blood and ocular fluid. It's a 0.08, comes back for ethanol, correct?
Correct.
Ethanol can be introduced in the system through something like vodka, correct?
Yes.
Am I correct that somebody who is, for example, 6'2", 228 pounds, they are going to require a lot more alcohol to get to that level than someone who is much smaller, say 5'2", 110 pounds?
In general, yes.
Okay. Can you tell me, in your training experience, what the general effects of alcohol are on somebody?
Alcohol is a central nervous system depressant, and its effects are to cause drowsiness, it impairs short-term memory, it alters a person's sense of judgment. One of the areas in the brain that it acts at, it's called the prefrontal cortex. That's the area of the brain that governs our behavior. and that's the area where when we encounter a situation, we determine whether or not it's something we want to engage in or something we avoid. It's called risk-taking behavior. Alcohol suppresses risk-taking or alters risk-taking behavior. And so as the alcohol level increases, things that when you are not under the influence of alcohol would seem too risky for you to do, you begin to engage in those behaviors.
Okay.
And alcohol also has motor effects. It alters your balance. People will have, at elevated alcohols, what's called a staggering gait. They stumble. They have to reach out and hold on to things to maintain balance.
Let's talk about cocaine. You also detected the, I guess the coke. You tested positive for 0.06 milligrams per liter of cocaine, correct?
Correct.
And I want to make sure that I understood your testimony. You testified that cocaine could have been introduced into the decedent's system as much as 8 to 10 hours prior to his death, correct?
Yes.
It also could have been introduced into his system moments before his death, correct? So if it was introduced to his system 8 to 10 hours before, that would have required him to have ingested a lot more cocaine than if he had introduced it moments before his death, correct?
That, of course, depends upon the purity of the cocaine used, but if we say that the same purity is administered, then the longer the time frame then suggests that looking back over a longer time frame, you'd have to start at a higher amount, which would give you a higher concentration.
So you cannot testify one way or another whether this decedent 5 minutes before he died ingested cocaine or not, correct?
Correct.
That is entirely plausible based on your findings. Is that correct?
I wouldn't say 5 minutes, 20 or 30 minutes.
Okay. Okay, so 20 to 30 minutes is entirely plausible.
Yes.
Okay. You say cocaine is a stimulant, correct?
Correct.
Could you please tell us the general effects of cocaine on a person?
The effects of cocaine depend upon the individual, and even though it's a stimulant, its effects depend upon where or how long it's been since the person has taken cocaine, their pattern of use, in other words, whether they're a person who simply uses 1 or 2 lines of cocaine, a line being about a 10 milligram dose, and snorts that, versus whether or not the cocaine is used in a binging type of administration pattern. And many cocaine users essentially fall into 2 broad categories. The lower dose, just take a few lines or a small amount of cocaine, and then that's all they take, versus the binge cocaine user, which is the user who essentially gets as much cocaine as they can, and they take it all over a period of hours, sometimes even days. And so there's a point where if you're fairly naive to cocaine, its stimulant effects are, it will increase awareness, it will help you overcome fatigue effects, It acts as an anesthetic, and its primary action in the brain is it releases dopamine. Dopamine is the pleasure neurochemical, and that's what's related to addiction. When a person has habituated to cocaine, or in other words is a cocaine addict, then generally the use of cocaine is to stave off the adverse effects of withdrawal. And so when the dopamine begins to fall off because there's no cocaine releasing dopamine, then those effects are the person becomes irritable, jittery, movements are, it's something called stereotypy. It's essentially the repetition of the same movement over and over again. And so the person will take cocaine to prevent those effects. At that point, cocaine, although a stimulant, can cause euphoria and sedation. And so, depending on where the person is in this cycle, or whether or not they use in this cycle, will determine what the general effects of cocaine on that person are.
Am I correct that cocaine as a stimulant, one symptom of that can be an increase in aggression?
Yes.
Am I correct that you use the term flight or fright, or fight or flight?
Yes, I'm sorry.
During the direct examination. What did you mean by that?
The general effect of a stimulant is to release catecholamines in the body. And catecholamines are things like epinephrine and norepinephrine. And those are what puts you in that kind of flight syndrome, where you're hyper alert and your movements are quicker, and so you respond much more quickly to external events.
Now you indicate, we're going to go to Flocka. You indicated that Flocka is also a stimulant. Is that correct?
Correct.
You also characterize it as a hallucinogen, correct?
Correct.
A hallucinogen is something that can cause somebody to actually see things that aren't there. Is that correct?
Yes, hallucinogens alter your perception of reality.
Okay. And so what does that mean? Tell me about that.
Well, it means something different for everyone who takes a hallucinogen. And it means something different based on the dose that you take. And it means something different based upon underlying psychopathologies and the general character of a person. And I know they're very nebulous terms, but this is what makes studying and understanding hallucinogens such a complicated matter. All we know is, the best way to define it is that when people take them, things appear contrary or different than the reality that a person not under the effect of a hallucinogen perceives. That can be an enhanced sense of well-being in some people. People say that they feel music, or they hear color, or they see things that aren't there.
Now,
Can we go sidebar for a second, please? You guys want to stand up and take a stretch? And you were the first one, I knew it. Take a stretch break, but do you mind if he goes ahead with the questioning? Go right ahead.
So you've got a stimulant that can cause an increase in aggression. You've got a hallucinogen that can cause people to have their sense of reality altered. Has there been any studies as to what happens when you mix those two?
No.
Okay. So you can't testify as to what somebody undergoing an increase in aggression and also undergoing the effects of a hallucinogen, what is going through their mind?
There are no clinical trials or controlled studies in which those kinds of things are evaluated. All we know about alpha PVP it's referred to as anecdotal information. It's the information that we obtain from observers of individuals who are later determined to be under the influence of one or more or a combination of these types of drugs. But no controlled studies. They're obviously unethical.
You testified on direct that you can't testify, that you cannot testify as to when the decedent ingested the flocka, how long prior to his death he ingested the flocka. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Could have been immediately before his death, or it could have been much longer before that. Is that correct?
Not a clue.
Am I correct that, having said that, am I correct that there is evidence that flocka continues to affect a person sometimes long after they have ingested it?
There is, again, anecdotal information that we've gotten from people who've been on alpha PVP or cathinones for an extended period of time, meaning more, and extended simply in pharmacology or toxicology means more than a few uses, where in rehab, for example, they're known to not be under the influence of the drug, but circumstances can invoke the same types of behaviors that have been seen when people are directly under the influence of the drug.
This combination that we see in this decedent, alcohol, marijuana, cocaine, flocka. As you sit there today, could you begin to guess as to what affects those four substances, if all four of them were affecting them at the same time, would have on a person?
Not without either knowing or suggesting possible scenarios in terms of how long the person's been using any or all of the drugs, how often they've used them together, and the time frame in which the drugs were used and the time frame between that use and the time of death. So it's a very complex picture, and toxicological results should never be, especially in post-mortem cases where we're interested in cause of death, can never be interpreted in isolation from as much information as we can get about a particular individual.
Judge Kunsman, please.
Yeah. Ladies and gentlemen, I know we're going to be out of here by 6 o'clock, I promise you. What we're going to do is we're going to take about just a real quick 5-minute break, okay? So if you guys want to go back there, stretch those cold water on your face, cover your consulting your UCS sweatshirt. You need to bring a blanket maybe next week. So, doing a warm up. Go ahead.
In 2015, am I correct that you testified before a Broward County grand jury that was doing an investigation on synthetic drugs in Broward County?
Correct.
And you testified in that grand jury as to what was known at the time about the effects of alpha PVP.
Yes.
And I'm going to read some of the findings of that Broward County grand jury and ask you if you disagree with them. Okay?
Okay.
So one of the findings was that a user of alpha PVP can be incredibly strong, which has been described as superhuman strength, and is often coupled with a loss of awareness of reality and surroundings. Do you disagree with that?
Only in part.
Okay, what's the part that you disagree with?
Well, people don't get more strength from the use of a cathinone. And although there's no direct, since we haven't really studied it, but my understanding of the pharmacology is that a person's perception to pain is altered, and therefore they can exert more of their normal physical strength because they're not limited by pain. So it isn't as if the drug confers additional strength outside of the norm of their build and things like that.
Gotcha. Let me know if you agree or disagree with this. Users can experience hallucinations, paranoia, delusions, psychosis, decreased inhibitions, severe anxiety, aggressiveness, violence, self-destructive behavior, high body temperatures, and even death.
Yes.
Yes, you agree?
Yes, I agree. Excuse me.
Am I correct that one of the noteworthy, do you agree or disagree that one of the noteworthy adverse reactions to alpha PVP is a symptom referred to as excited delirium?
Yes, it can be.
And excited delirium is begins with a sharp rise in body temperature. Is that correct?
No, excited delirium is not necessarily a comorbidity with malignant hyperthermia.
Why don't you define for me what excited delirium is?
Excited delirium is a condition where a person becomes essentially uncontrollable. They're experiencing some type of altered reality. They typically become very aggressive. They exert this unusual strength and require a significant effort to restrain them, either chemical restraint through drugs like ketamine or a number of large people. And so in excited delirium, the person is essentially just an emotive being. They're just in this state of, whether it's fear or anger or rage, they're essentially out of control.
While the jury was here, you testified as to that cocaine can give someone the experience of fight or flight. Do you agree that alpha PVP can also give somebody the experience of fight or flight?
Yes.
And that is fight or flight is a physiological reaction that occurs in response to a perceived harmful event, attack, or threat to survival, where their bodies provide additional energy and strength to resist whatever perceived threat that may be.
Yes, that's reasonable.
Am I correct that one of the symptoms of alpha PVP can be paranoia?
Yes,
In fact, extreme paranoia.
yes.
Can you define what that means, please?
The reports that have been given about alpha PVP use tend to focus on the fact that individuals have a dysphoric reaction, and so the response never seems to be happy unicorns and butterflies perception of the world. It's a view of the world around them that is troubling, that is against them, that is trying to attack them, hurt them, or people have been reported to see individuals and believe that they're aliens who are trying to take over their bodies or something like that. And so the effects are generally adverse and put people on edge and in fear.
Now, you have been the toxicologist in the Broward Medical Examiner's Office since prior to 2014, correct?
Correct.
So you observed the first case, and you observed the subsequent cases where flocka was detected in the office, correct?
Correct.
And you were able to, based on what you observed and the reports that came along with it, you've been able to make the opinions that you just gave us here today, correct?
Yes, but if I may say that they're, of course, trying to maintain or be current in the literature. I have read reports from other jurisdictions, other medical examiners' offices, reports from behavioral health people, and in addition to the post-mortem cases that we do perform analysis on DUI cases in Broward County where a blood sample or a urine sample, but in this case let's just talk about blood, are submitted as part of an investigation into a motor vehicle accident or bad driving behavior. So I've seen reports on individuals, very few living, and the bulk of our cases, of course, are post-mortem.
Okay. Now, the testimony that you just gave from just these questions that I've asked you so far, was that testimony consistent with the testimony you gave before the Broward County Grand Jury?
To the best of my recollection, yes.
Okay. And it was the state attorney's office that subpoenaed you to testify before that grand jury. Is that correct?
Yes.
Nothing further with regards to the proffer, Judge. Do you have any?
Got any cross on the proffer?
No, no.
Okay, Doctor.
Judge, we renew our request to be allowed to ask to get this testimony in before the jury.
My ruling stays the same. Doctor, thank you. Your excuse.
Thank you.
Now you can bring the jury out.
And we'll just at that point say no redirect in front of the jury?
Yes, absolutely. Please be seated.
No redirect on Dr. Kunsman, Your Honor. Statement called Kate Abrahamsen.
This will be the last witness of the day. Please raise your right hand. You swear or affirm to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
Yes, sir.
Put your hand down, please take a seat, state your name, spell your last name.
Kathleen Abrahamsen, Abrahamsen.
May inquire.
Thank you. Investigator Abrahamsen, how are you employed?
I'm currently an investigator with the State Attorney's Office here in Broward County
How long have you worked for the State Attorney's Office?
for 5 years now.
Prior to working with the State Attorney's Office, what did you do?
I was a domestic violence investigator at the Criminal Investigation Division for the Jackson Police Department in Jackson, Tennessee.
Prior to that, where did you work?
I was at Fort Lauderdale. I worked at the Fort Lauderdale Police Department as a police officer and police sergeant,
And how long did you work for the Fort Lauderdale Police Department?
10 years.
Are you a sworn law enforcement officer?
Yes, ma'am.
Do you maintain certifications and accreditations from FDLE?
Yes, ma'am.
And what is FDLE?
Florida Department of Law Enforcement.
With regards to the case of State of Florida versus Armando Baptista, did you become involved in this investigation?
Yes.
At what point did you become involved?
This was in 2014.
I would direct your attention to June 25th of 2014. Did you have an occasion to meet with an individual who later became known to as Armando Baptista?
Yes, ma'am.
Who was there?
The assistant state attorney handling the case at the time, Adriana Alcalde, myself, Mr. Baptista, and Mr. Marcellus, his attorney. I don't know his first name.
I'm now showing you what's been previously known as States AA for identification purposes only. Do you recognize that?
Yes, ma'am.
How do you recognize that?
This is a statement, a recorded statement that I took from Mr. Baptista.
Have you had a chance to review it before coming to court today?
Yes, I did.
And is that your initials and date on it?
Yes,
at
it
the
is.
bottom?
Yes, it is.
Is it in the same or substantially similar condition as when you recorded it on June 25th of 2014 and there are no additions to it?
Yes.
Here at this time, the state would request permission to publish states, to enter states AA into evidence as states 27 and publish to the jury.
No objection, Your Honor.
Go ahead.
Thank you. And Investigator Abrahamsen, is this audio or video?
It's audio.
The time now is 9:16 a.m. This is the voluntary take statement of Armando Baptista. It's being taken at the Broward County Courthouse, 201 Southeast 6th Street, Fort Lauderdale, room 670. And, all right, Mr. Armando Lopez Baptista? Yes. Okay. Before I ask you any questions, I want to advise you of your rights under law. Do you understand that I'm a police officer?
Yes.
Okay. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can be used against you in a court of law. You do not have to speak to me or answer any questions if you don't want to. Do you understand?
Yes.
Okay, you have the right to an attorney and to have him present with you while you are being questioned now or in the future. Do you understand that?
Yes.
And for the record,
My name is Maximo Sellers, and I represent Mr. Armando Baptista.
also, if you cannot afford to hire an attorney, one would be appointed to you to represent you before any questioning if you wish. Do you understand that?
Yes.
And if you decide to answer any questions now or without an attorney, you will still have the right to stop answering questions at any time to talk to your attorney. Do you understand that?
Yes.
Okay. In regards to this investigation, have you previously asked any police officer to speak to an attorney? I think he did, and that's why we have the attorney here. Okay, all right, for the record, the answer would be yes, and we do have your attorney present. Okay, knowing and understanding his rights, and I have explained them to you, do you want to answer questions now without an attorney present? That answer would be no, you have your attorney present? Okay. So what I'm going to ask you to do, can we have you sign here? I'm just going to ask you to initial off. If you could just go ahead and initial, you can read the question, initial, and then write your name at the top, or at the bottom.
And just to let you know, she's not a police officer with the Miramar Police Department. She's with my
The state attorney.
State attorney's office.
Okay. Just spell your name there. Okay. Okay, this statement is being taken in reference to Miramar Police Department case number 1404-05-020, which pertains to an incident that occurred on April 25th, 2014, and resulted in the death of Mr. Bakaraji Muhammad Knight. For the record, I am a sworn police officer and work for the state attorney's office here in Broward County. Do you understand that person who knowingly makes a false statement to a law enforcement officer while under oath is subject to charges of perjury?
Yes.
Okay. All right, please raise your right hand, sir. Okay, do you solemnly swear or affirm to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
Yes.
So help you God?
Yes.
Okay, for the record, he raised his hand. Okay, can you just, you said you wanted to come here to give your side of what happened on that night. Can you just take us back to how it all happened? Maybe start earlier in the day, how you ended up?
Well, I ended up over Corey's house because I didn't think to meet my brother. I didn't know there was people going to be back there. I was just hanging, a couple of friends. I haven't seen my brother-in-law in a week, so I went there to go.
What's your brother-in-law's name?
Marlon Williams. And me and Demetrius, we went over there. I don't remember what time that was. When we got there, there was people there. And so happened to be Corey's birthday a couple of days later, so, people was there. And I went, I said, what's up, everybody, and boom, and a couple of minutes later, Mr. Muhammad Knight came, and he said, what's up, I don't know him, I didn't know him, and I said, what's up, and about a half an hour later, my brother-in-law left. About 10 minutes after he left, we left, me and Demetrius left.
And that would be Demetrius after?
Yes. Okay. And we pulled up this stop sign on Miramar Parkway. It's a two-way street. So we waited for the traffic to stop so we could go across and make a left. So we sit at the stop sign, just waiting, chit-chatting, waiting for traffic to stop, and my door just swung open. And the man just standing there, he just looked like, I just trying to run, and I'm like, what? He fucked in his thing, what the hell? He was I seen his hands come around, his right hand come around. I didn't know what it was. But he hit me in the head, then I realized it was a bottle. He hit me twice in the head, and the bottle broke the second time. At that time, the bottle broke. I don't know if I mentioned before. Every time the bottle broke, I just went for my knife. And I just started, I stabbed him, like, I didn't know where I stabbed him. I don't know where I stabbed him on. And I was holding, trying to grab his arms, because he had a broken glass coming at him. So I grabbed his arms, and the knife that I had didn't do nothing, so they didn't stop it. So I had his arms, and he was just all over him. I'm trying to stop the ball from coming at me. So took a piece of my lip, and he's all like trying to stick the bottle, the glass bottle, in my face. And I had to flick my knife because it didn't do nothing to him, and I wasn't strong enough to hold him in one hand. So I had to flick my knife, and I grabbed him with both hands. And this time he had both his hands, but this time he had the bottle. The broken bottle was like this close to my face. And I'm holding him, and I'm screaming for help, and I'm screaming for help, and I'm telling him, please stop. And he was just determined. He had to look at his face. I don't know what he was on, but oh Lord, I don't know. I kept screaming, and he wouldn't stop. And that's when Demetrius came and stabbed him in the back, because he just went this. And he backed off. That's when I closed the door real quick, and Demetrius got in the car, and we left.
So you said that you saw Demetrius stab him in the back?
I didn't see him. He told me afterwards that he stabbed him back. He was coming, when I was holding him like this, it was like, he wouldn't stop. And I kept screaming for help, and I'm screaming for help. And then he went like this, like, oh. And he stepped back. As I closed the door, and I see Demetrius get in the car, and we left. And Demetrius said he had stabbed him in the back. He said he had to, because if he didn't, I would not be here. Because that glass, that he was not stopping. He was not going to stop.
Okay, what kind of knife was this that you had?
Those one little work knife I don't have in my pocket, because I do my maintenance, and my job is doing maintenance with a maintenance man. And I always have it. Because I use cut boxes. I use it for take like sockets, wall sockets out, like a screwdriver. It's a little Walmart knife.
Okay, does it swing open? Is it a pocket knife?
Yeah, it's a little pocket knife.
So you had to open it up?
Yeah, well, I got the long one, you just open one hand. You use it, so, I use it every day. It's like when you're a little handy man too. I could just open it one hand. And it was the only thing I could do. It was the only way I could protect myself with that. And that didn't stop him. And I don't know this man. I've never met this man in my life before. Never seen him, never met him. Never.
You didn't have any words with him?
Nope. This is something that came out of nowhere. It's not something that I expected. It's not something that I looked for. I never met the man. I never expected. Like, when he opened my door, I was so shocked. Like, what?
Anything when you were going?
No.
You did?
No problem, nothing. We just chit-chatting, like, blah, blah, blah. Just waiting for the traffic to go by. If you ever go on that street, you'll see there's a two-way traffic. One goes this way, the other one goes this way. We have to go like this, come this way. So we was waiting for traffic to stop so we can go.
Okay.
And we didn't even know that he came behind us.
So your door just opened?
My door just opened and he just attacked.
And how did he hit you with the bottle?
He had the bottle. Like, I was sitting there, I was looking, I was like, just looking at him, so I'm like, what the? Just boom. He was like, boom, boom. Hit me in my head twice, and that's when the bottle broke. The second time I covered it, I went like this with it, that's when he cut me right here.
So you were inside the car?
Yes.
And you leaned back like toward the driver?
No. I leaned like this on my hand. That's when you first came into the place, it was like...
Well, if you're sitting in the seat, here's the car door, the door opens.
The door's open, I'm like, boom, like, boom.
Right. So you moved back into the car?
Oh, yeah, like this.
Okay.
And that's when he attacked.
And how did he hit you in the head then?
He was just standing, he didn't like...
Inside the car?
Yeah,
He
inside
was
the car.
standing outside the car?
Yeah. So he leaned inside the car and hit me in the head. Like, once he opened the door, he leaned inside the car and started attacking me. He wasn't standing outside the car, he leaned in. That's why he had...
Let me ask you, were you drinking that evening? Did you have anything to drink at this?
I had a shot of Jack Daniels before I left my house, and that was hours before that.
So you didn't have anything to drink at yourself now?
No.
You didn't drink any beer?
No.
Okay. So the beer bottle was in
It was in his hands.
was in his hand, and he struck you twice in the head with this? At any time did you get out of the car?
No.
Well, he hit you on the head, and then what happened to the part of the ball he had in his hand?
I don't know. Like the part of the ball that he's trying to stab me with, I don't know. All I knew is once he stepped back from the car and I closed the door, I just shut the door and we just got in and we just, there was no chance of telling me, so that was it.
Okay. When he came in there and he says, he just hit you with the bottle, and you got your knife, where do you think you touched him with the knife?
I don't know. I just...
And you're kind of making like a stabbing motion, not a slashing motion, but a choking.
Yes, I couldn't slash because he was too close, like he was right here, right there. So I had to stab him like this. It was the only thing I could do. I couldn't run, I couldn't do nothing. I was just stuck there. The only way I could defend myself was that. The only thing I found was my knife. That was it.
So where do you think you would have if you injured him?
I have no idea.
So you were just...
Yes, I did whatever I could to survive.
Did you see any other people there?
No.
You didn't see brother?
No, I was in the car and I didn't see nobody there.
Did you see what car he got out of?
No.
And what happened then with you said that, how did Mr. Demetrius, how did he get the knife? How do you know it was the same knife? What happened there?
He told me it was the same knife because he picked up from the floor. When I realized that my knife was doing until now it's true, I couldn't hold it in one hand. I took my knife, I just tweaked it. And that's what Demetrius said, the knife was on the floor. He told me he tried to pull him back, but Demetrius like half paralyzed. He can't even talk right because he's like, his body is dying on him, giving up on him. He said he tried to grab a guy, but the guy was just like, just stroking him off, like, get off my back. So he said the knife on the floor, he just picked up, just stabbed him. So the guy was...
Okay, so you're sitting in the seat of the car, and some person comes over and opens the door, Mr. Demetrius. And he's standing there. And then he comes, is he in the car on you?
He's half in the car and half out.
Okay, but at this time, Mr. Elder was able to go around him somehow and reach into the floorboard to pick up the knife?
No, the knife, when I threw the knife, it was in between the door and him. It wasn't in the car to the knife. And I took the knife, I went like
oh, like out of the car?
Yeah, it fell out the car.
Okay,
yeah.
So it went in the car.
Oh, no, it fell out the car.
It fell out of the car?
Yeah. He was a big guy.
You weren't worried that he would pick that up?
No way, but then I figured if he was bent over to pick up the knife, I could do something before he closed the door. So that's why I threw out the car, not in the car. If it was in the car, then he could have picked it up. But they would have landed right in front of him, then he would have picked it up. So, but it wasn't like, it was just a motion thing. It was like, boom, and grab the bottle, the hand with the bottle. Because at the moment, I was worried about that bottle sticking in my neck. But yeah, if I was to drop the knife in the car, yeah, he could have picked it up.
Okay. So you never got out of the car?
No.
You never stepped out?
No.
Your feet never got on the ground outside the car?
No.
You never got in the car?
No.
You never saw another person there?
No.
You never saw the other vehicle behind you?
No.
You don't know who that was?
No.
And your recollection of the person, Mr. Knight, was attacking you, he was on you?
Yes.
And then he made that motion, I guess, or
yes,
was
that means like, and then he stepped back, and that's when I got the chance to close the door. That's what made him stop.
What made him stop?
And we went like this, he started that, he didn't stop, and he was so strong, I couldn't both my hands, and I couldn't stop him. He was going to stick that ball in my neck. If he didn't go like this and stop, that was the only time he stopped was when he went like this, like, boom, and he stepped back.
And did you see Mr. Elder outside the car?
No, that's when he came, he ran back, he got in the car, and he's like, I had no choice. He's like, he told me, I'm begging for help. He said, if he didn't die, I wouldn't. like the man lost his life. And this is a sad thing, somebody lose their life. But I don't know the man. It's like this man just came into my life out of nowhere and he tried to kill me, and now I'm in jail. My family's just messed up from this man that I never met in my life.
Okay, well, after you were attacked, what did you do?
I was terrified. I went straight home to my wife and my kids. And I told my wife what happened, and I kept saying I want to go to the police, and we discussed it, we talked about it. But I didn't know he died. I didn't know he died until days later. And we talked about it, and I was like, I'm going to call the police, and she was like, well, no, just wait till tomorrow and see what happens. So I waited till the next day, and we talked about it. She was like, you should call a lawyer, because, these things, they can get, pretty ugly and stuff like that. And I called him, and
why, would you call the police and just say just exactly what you told us? Okay.
Yes, I advise that.
With the, did Mr. Elder drop you off at your house? Is that how you got home, or did you walk home from somewhere else?
No, he took me.
So when you left the scene there, he just drove straight to your house and dropped you off? And then you don't know where you went after that?
Thank you.
Okay. And you said Mr. Knight hit you twice in the head with a beer bottle? And the second time he hit you with broke? And do you know what happened with the glass?
No. I know there's glass in the car.
Did you go to the hospital to get treatment?
A couple of days later, I went to the hospital because I kept getting dizzy, like my head would get dizzy. And I had really bad shoulder pains, like really bad neck pains. They took my scan and they said there was nothing wrong.
Okay. Now, were you wearing a seatbelt anymore?
I think so. Yeah, I think so. I don't really know, but I think I was. I'm one of those guys that I always put on the seatbelt. I have kids, so I tell them to do it, so therefore I can't tell them to do it, me not do it, so I always tell them, I always put on the seatbelt. So yes, I think from what I can remember, I think I had on. I don't really, I'm so confused about this.
Did you recognize the victim from the party?
When you open the door, yes. That's why I was shocked, like what the?
Did you guys exchange words at the party? Anything?
None. The only thing we said was hello, what's up, like you go to a party, barbecue, you meet people, you say hi to everybody. That was it. Like,
Could there be any reason why he would want to attack you?
I have no idea. I heard somebody say it was because it's something that happened like 8 months before to one of his friends that I punched his friend in the face, something like that. But I have no idea. Like I said, I never met the man in my life. That was my first time ever seeing him.
And in the party, did you see him with a girlfriend?
I think I remember because there was some new girls there. Like, these are all the same crowd all the time. When there's new people, yeah, you see them, yeah.
But you didn't see her in the car?
Yeah.
In the car behind you?
No, I didn't see who was in the car behind me.
Now, did he have a red cup at all in his hand?
No, nothing, no.
Just a question. Is there any way Demetrius could have just driven off?
No. the way the traffic was coming, if we drove off, we would have got hit. Or we would have hit somebody else. There was no way. And when he started attacking, it seemed so long, but it was 2 seconds. It was like seconds. The only time that we could have got away is like when Demetrius got in the car, then there was no traffic. When he started back into traffic, there was no way you could just take off.
And have you spoken to Demetrius?
Not lately, not. Since like the last time I talked to him was like a week after the police picked me up. I mean, before the police picked me up. That was when he was in the, he had just came out of the hospital. And me and my wife gave him a ride home.
Do you know why he was in the hospital?
Yeah, he had done surgery.
Okay, but it's nothing to do with this incident?
No.
Okay. How long were you guys at that stop sign when that car came behind you?
Before he attacked me, we was there for, I would say, 10, 15 seconds. It was like, you know, you pull up the stop sign, you just wait for the traffic to go by. That was it. It was so unexpected. It was so weird, you know?
The girlfriend never said stop, get off him, never heard any of that?
I never heard of any of that. I never knew there was a girlfriend there.
Do you have anything else you want to add?
Yeah, I want to beg to go home to my family. I need to go and take care of my family. This is not a situation where I look for it. I didn't put myself in the situation. I'm on my way home. I'm in the car on my way home. This man that I have no idea who he is came and attacked me. And now my family we have to suffer. I'm sorry the man is dead. I did not mean to kill the man. All I did was protect myself from him killing me. And now my family's suffering, and I beg that I can go home to them. I need to go. I need to take care of my family. I have kids. My wife, she cannot do by herself.
And just real quick, Demetrius, you said Demetrius is the one, when Demetrius stabbed, you said from behind?
Yes.
That's when he kind of stopped?
Yeah, that's when he
Did Demetrius tell you what he was going to do with his vehicle afterwards? Did he tell you?
As a matter of fact, his vehicle was at my house. Because his tag expired. His girlfriend's going to pick him up, yes. His vehicle, the tag expired that day. That's why he had the car. That's why we enjoyed it to the last day, basically.
Just a moment ago, you said I didn't mean to kill the man,
I didn't.
but you did? Is that what you said, that you didn't mean to?
I just tried to make him stop. All I wanted him to do was stop attacking me. But that was it. I didn't know he died until they said it.
But Demetrius could have.
I don't think he could have. The situation happened. To me, it was like long, but it was so fast. It was one of those chaotic things that, I think the cell phone's the last thing in your mind. You know, being in that car, it would be the last thing in your mind. It wasn't like, you know, or here he comes, let's call the police, or this is going on, let's call the police. It was just like,
I'm just wondering, like, why Demetrius couldn't have, like, sped up, maybe not gone into traffic, but gone around or driven, I mean...
You couldn't, if you go on that street, you'll see that you can't go around. If you stop at the stop sign, if you go a little bit, you're going to be right, the traffic going to be.
At the same time, if the bomb was coming at him and his detective service, he was fighting off and he's calling for help, Demetrius said, what can I do to get this guy off me? So that's what it sounds like to me. So he's calling for help, he's fighting the knife is fist going out the car, he's fighting with both hands, but this one arm is coming at him with the bottle. He's calling for help. And Demetrius gets out of the car and comes around trying to help.
And Demetrius, his body he has this thing, that's why he's in the hospital, he gets fluid. He took like 10 bags of food out of him. That he can't move, like, he can't hardly, like, he can't chew his food enough. He has to go like this to chew his food, and then after a while he couldn't even do that. So when he was in the car, he's like paralyzed, basically. Like half his body is paralyzed. He has no strength. Like, you can even, he can go like this, like, go like that and make a mark. He can go like this.
Just saying the bottle was broken on your head. So if there was DNA on that bottle at the end of it, it would have to be your DNA.
Yes.
You never hit the victim with a bottle.
No.
But if the victim is holding, the alleged victim in this case, if he's holding the bottle, his DNA is going to.
If he's holding it from.
If he's holding like this,
Right.
and he hits him.
I'm talking about the end.
The end part, if it's broken in the heart.
Right.
The end part that was broken in the car? Oh.
Do you really give it on?
No.
Was your elderly there? Do you know what kind of beer you did? Was victim drinking in the party, or did you not notice?
I did not notice. I didn't pay no attention to him. Like, I don't know him, so to me it was like, once you said, what's up, then that was it. I didn't pay no attention to him at all.
He didn't look at you funny, he didn't like...
Nothing. Like, I have no clue. Believe me, I don't go to clubs, I don't go to parties, I try to avoid all that stuff. I have one thing, and that's my family. That's it. That's all I think they care about. If I see any problems, I'm avoiding it. I find every which way so I can avoid it. And I didn't sense nothing. I didn't feel like, nothing.
But you say this is a retaliation, Mr. Muhammad retaliated because of the fact that transpired between you and his friend 8 months ago?
Okay, from what they told me, the same guy, Walter's family, he told me that 8 months before that, I found him in the car beating up his wife. So I tried to stop him. He told me no more business. He swung at me and I hit him. Boom. So I guess this guy is his friend. Muhammad is his friend. So I guess he told Muhammad. Now Muhammad comes to barbecue. I guess Muhammad sees me. And he told, this is all the things I found out after all this happened. He told Muhammad, leave him alone. Like, I'll deal with him, me and him. Because we talk and we chit-chat. I'm like, I'm sorry, like, he's sorry, because we have family barbecues together, all that stuff. And he told Muhammad to leave me alone. And he said, Muhammad still came after me. All those people at the party, from what I can tell, they knew he came after me because they seen him leave and then they seen him come after us after we left.
Who told you that they saw that? They saw him leave after you?
Corey, Stanley, all of them, they was all there.
Do you have their last names?
No, I just know my first names.
Do you have phone numbers for them?
No.
Could your wife be able to get us phone numbers for these people?
Corey is my barber. He lived there. He was at their house.
Right? And Stanley?
Stanley, I don't know what it is. He's one of those guys that he's very good.
I'm just trying to see if I can get people to say that they saw him leave after you. So the most information you give me, that would be helpful.
I don't know, like, see these people, when I hang out with them, like for a barbecue, something, they come to my house. Corey's my barber, so I go there. I used to go there all the time with my kids, we barbecue. We lived at their house. Walter Stanley, the police talked to him already. Believe me, if I could avoid it, if I knew...
Anybody else? And how do you know the police talked to him?
It's in the paper. If I knew, if I even smell that this was going to happen, I would have found a different way home. I would have did something else.
Okay. Anything else you want to add?
Yeah, please find a way to send me home to my family so I can help my family. I mean,
Anything you want to add about the incident?
I just defended myself the best I could. There's nothing else I could do.
Okay. For the record, the statement was being taken by myself, Investigator Kathleen Abrahamsen with the State Attorney's Office. Present is Assistant State Attorney Adrian Osvaldo, and also Attorney Mr. Manson Martellus.
Investigator Abrahamsen, can you demonstrate for the jury what motions Mr. Baptista was making when you're talking about the stabbing versus slashing?
He was making this type of a gesture. Instead of a slashing, it was a stabbing, poking.
And do you recall about how long his reach was extended?
No, I don't.
At points during the statement we just listened to, there's a statement, and the defendant says he was doing something like this. What was the defendant doing?
Several times he referenced that he went, Mr. Baptista arched his back and made a sound, that the victim did that.
Was he describing something that the victim had done or that he had done?
Well, when he said it, I guess he said that the victim went, and did the gesture, but.
And at one, and this probably have to give you a copy of the transcript to be a little bit clearer on this. At one point during the statement, he says, when he went like this, so let me show you the transcript and see if it'll help. Bottom of page 10. So the last two answers by Mr. Baptista. There's a discussion about what made the victim stop in Mr. Baptista's description of the incident. What was he doing?
I don't recall that. I mean, just when he made the sound and arched his back, but in this particular moment, I don't recall if he made any gestures or anything.
And do you see the individual that you took the statement from on June of 2014 for today?
Yes, ma'am.
Could you please point him and identify
Mr. Baptista with the glasses in the middle.
Here, I made the record reflect witness and identify the defendant.
So reflect.
No further questions?
Defense?
Thank you, Your Honor. Hello, Officer Abrahamsen, how are you?
Fine.
I just have a couple of quick questions. Where exactly did this statement take place?
At the time, we were in the old courthouse, I guess, on the 6th floor of the old state attorney's office, the building that's not being used anymore.
Okay, so it was at the state attorney's office?
Yes.
And what is Mr. Baptista wearing in the statement?
I think he was wearing a jumpsuit. I don't remember.
So when you say jumpsuit, you're describing typically what inmates who are in custody wear, correct?
I believe so.
Okay. And so when he comes into the room, there's a deputy in there as well, correct?
Right.
Because he's in custody.
Right.
And so he's shackled and in handcuffs. I believe it's handcuffs that are around the wrist, correct?
I believe he was wearing handcuffs.
And they're attached around the waist?
No, I don't know if he had, I don't remember if he had shackles and waist. I don't remember if he had that on. But I
Okay.
think he had handcuffs on.
Typically, when inmates who are in custody are transported, they have the shackles around the waist.
Yes.
The handcuffs are attached to the waist.
Yes.
And there's no way for them to extend their arms out, correct?
Right, but I don't recall if he did have that on or if he did take it off. I don't remember.
Okay. I noticed that we have an audio of the statement, but not a videotape, correct?
Right.
And a video would have allowed the jury to see Armando's demeanor and his face. It would have allowed him to see these gestures that you said that he's doing that you can't recall, correct?
Yes, yes.
Does the state attorney's office have a video camera?
I imagine that we do, but typically for statements, we just take an audio statement.
Did anyone instruct you not to use a video camera
No.
during this?
No, absolutely not.
And I just want to clarify something. Mr. Marcellus, that's not the attorney that you see
No.
over here, right?
No.
Okay, and so on the tape, when we hear you ask, why didn't you just call police and tell them what you're telling us, it's actually Mr. Marcellus's voice that we hear responding because I advised him not to do so,
Yes.
correct? I have no further questions.
Are you direct?
No, Your Honor.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Excused. Well, ladies and gentlemen, that concludes our day today. I have confirmed that, I know I mentioned to you earlier, you might have seen my assistant coming in and out here, but we are now going to be in a position on Monday to start Tuesday, excuse me. If you get here at 10 o'clock Tuesday, we'll get rolling. Wednesday and Thursday, again, I told you, we've got them cleared, so we'll start at 8:30, okay? Enjoy the long weekend, Veterans Day, and here we go again. Remember, don't talk about the case amongst yourselves as you're walking out or anybody else, and don't go on internet or anything else to find anything about the case, locations, etc., okay? Now have a good weekend.